The Snails by Patricia Highsmith. In the June 1967 issue of Saturday Evening Post. For Avery Clavering, a professor of zoology at a California university, it began with a footnote in a rather obscure book about mollusks. The existence of giant snails on the uninhabited island of Kuwa near the Matussas group has been reported by native Matussans, read the lines that fascinated Clavering. These snails, according to the natives, have a shell diameter of 20 feet and are man-eaters. Professor William J. Stead, long a resident of the Matussas, visited Kuwa in 1949 and found no trace of snails at all. Nevertheless, the legend persists. At 48, Professor Clavering had in no way achieved the recognition for which he longed, and he was well aware that the discovery of a new species, some animal, bird, reptile, even mollusk, to which he could give his name, would win him immortality in his field. Something or other Clavering. The sound of it lingered in his head, and his sabbatical leave, fortuitously, was almost due. Having refreshed his memory of the location of the Matussas, 3 small islands not far from Hawaii, Clavering addressed a request for further information to Professor Steed. He received the following reply, written on an abominable typewriter, the words so pale he could hardly make them out. Dear Professor Clavering, I have indeed heard of the giant snails of Kuwa, but before you make the long trip here, I must tell you what the natives have told me. About 20 years ago, they say, a group sailed to Kuwa determined to exterminate these supposedly man-eating snails, which the natives imagined might swim from Kuwa to the Matussas. The entire community of snails was killed off, I am told, except for one old fellow who got away. This, of course, is typical of native stories. There's always one that got away. It seems to me quite likely that the snails were no more than 3 feet in shell diameter, and that they were not, here a few words were completely illegible, due both to the pale ribbon and a squashed insect. Gather you have read of my 1949 effort to find the giant snails. It may interest you to know that I have since made several more trips to Kuwa. It was in order to continue my search for the snails, in fact, that I retired to the Matussas. But I now believe the snails to be mere folklore, figments of the natives' imagination. Were I in your place, I would not waste time or money on an expedition. Yours truly, William J. Steed. The note of sourness in Professor Steed's letter, due perhaps to Steed's bad luck, did not deter Professor Clavering, who had both time and money to spare. By mail he made arrangements for the hiring, in Hawaii, of a 30-foot sailboat with an auxiliary motor. He would leave his wife and daughter in Hawaii, he decided, to go on alone to the Matussas and to Kuwa, then return to his family for a more orthodox holiday. He would be away from them no more than a month. Probably that should be long enough to search for the giant snails. Something or other Claveringi. Yes, it was a worthwhile project. Because of Kuwa's isolation, the snails, whatever their size, were bound to be different from any known snails, if, of course, they existed at all. As Professor Clavering's excitement mounted, so did his hopes. He began to dream of the notes he might make, of the photographs he might take. It was late June when, equipped with water tanks, tinned beef and milk, biscuits, camera, knife, hatchet, and a rifle he scarcely knew how to use, Professor Clavering set forth in the Samantha from one of the Matussas Islands for Kuwa, some 25 miles away. Professor Steed, who had been his host for several days, saw him off off from the dock. Professor Steed admitted to being 75, but he looked even older, a result Clavering suspected of the ravages of drink coupled with Steed's now apparently aimless life. It was more than 2 years, he knew, since the old man had abandoned his quest for the giant snails. "I've given the last third of my life, you might say, to looking for those snails," Steed said, as Clavering climbed down into the Samantha. He sounded quite bitter, but when he added, "Well, that's man's fate, I suppose, the pursuit of the non-existent. Good luck to you, Professor Clavering." There was only a slight wistfulness in his voice, and he waved his old straw hat cheerfully as the Samantha chugged away from the dock. The wind was favorable, and Professor Clavering soon cut the motor and hoisted sail. He was an inexperienced sailor, but he paid close attention to his compass, and the wind held. In only a few hours Kuwa came into view, a tan hump on a sea of blue. Clavering saw no green until he was quite close, and then it was only the tops of some low trees. Already searching for anything that resembled a giant snail, he swore at himself for having forgotten to bring binoculars. But the island was only about 3 miles long and a mile wide. It could be thoroughly explored. He dropped anchor in a small bay, in water so clear he could see the sand beneath it, and stood for a moment on the Samantha's desk, gazing toward the island. No life was apparent except for a few birds circling above the trees, bright-crested birds whose cries were like nothing Clavering had ever heard before. There was no low-lying vegetation whatsoever, none of the grass and reeds that would have been natural to an island such as this, a fact auguring well for the presence of snails, which might have devoured everything green within their reach. Now it was almost 2 o'clock, and Clavering, who had breakfasted at 6, brewed coffee on his alcohol burner, and ate part of a papaya and 2 boiled eggs. Then, hunting knife and hatchet tucked in the belt of his khaki shorts, camera held high, he lowered himself from the Samantha into the neck-deep water and made his way to shore. He emerged panting. He was 20 pounds overweight, but soon recovered his breath, drying off in the warm sunlight. He looked happily about him. There was nothing, either moving or stationary, that in any way resembled the roundness of a snail shell. But snails were more or less nocturnal, he reminded himself, as he walked inland. They might now be sleeping in some cave or crevice from which they would emerge at nightfall. He had decided to cross the island and then circle it by following the coastline, but he had gone no more than a quarter of a mile before he was halted by the sight of 3 bent saplings with their top leaves chewed off. His heart leaped. The bases of the young trees were 4 inches in diameter. It would have taken a weight of at least 100 pounds to bend them down. He studied the trees and the ground about them for a trace of the glaze left by snails, but found none. Rain could have washed it away, he thought, and strode on to the far side of the island. Here he came upon a huge gully, mostly dry, almost 100 yards long, and about 30 feet deep, extending from a wide notch from the sea had eaten into the shore. The sandy land about the gully was moist, and there was a little vegetation, mostly patchy grass. But there were also a few small trees, and their lower branches, Clavering saw with delight, had all been stripped of their leaves. Stooping, he scanned the gully. He saw just below the edge on his side a sweeping, peak-tan curve of something neither rock nor sand. Something so large that for an instant he was unable to believe that he had found what he was looking for. If it was a snail, it was monstrous. Gasping, Clavering took an involuntary step backward, scattering pebbles upon the pink-tan surface below. Then he ran, rounding the inland end of the gully to reach the other side, from which he would have a better view. It was indeed a snail, and his shell was at least 15 feet high. To Professor Clavering, who was looking at its left side, the side without the spiral, it resembled a peach-colored sail filled with the wind. The great thing stirred, nacreous silvery patches gleaming and twinkling in the sunlight, and Clavering realized that it had been aroused by the little rain of pebbles. He stood rooted to the spot, thrilled as much by the phrase "something or other Claveringi" flashing in his brain as by the fact that he was looking upon something no man, no scientist at least, had ever looked upon before. The length of the snail's body, he reckoned, would be twice the diameter of its shell, 30 or more feet. The snail was backing in the gully, and the moist body, the color of tea with milk, came into view with the slowness of an enormous snake awakening from slumber. All was silence except for the faint rattle of pebbles dropping from the snail's underside as it lifted its head. Clavering retreated again, sending more pebbles down into the gully. The snail heard, and the enormous head turned very slowly toward him. The professor was paralyzed. The snail's face was gigantic, a face with drooping, scalloped cheeks, a face from which antennae 6 feet long extended, the eyes at their tips level with Clavering's own and scarcely 10 feet away. Bulging eyes that scrutinized him like a pair of oversized telescopes. The snail reared now, the antenna arching so that the eyes could keep him in view. A body 10 yards long? No, more like 15. The snail turned and moved toward him, and still Clavering did not budge. He knew about snails' teeth, 20-odd thousand pairs of them, even in a small garden snail, set in comb-like structures. A snail this size, he knew, could chew through a tree faster than a woodsman's axe. And yet, though the snail was advancing up the bank, he stood for a few seconds simply to admire it. His snail. The professor unslung his camera and took a picture, just as the snail hauled its shell over the edge of the gully. "You are magnificent," he said in a soft, awestruck voice. Then he took a few steps backwards. It was pleasant to realize that he could skip nimbly about, so to speak, observing the snail from all angles, while it could only creep toward him at what seemed like a rate of 1 yard in perhaps 10 seconds. He could watch the snail for an hour or so, Clavering decided, and then go back to the Samantha and write some notes. He could sleep aboard the boat, take some photographs tomorrow morning, then return to the Matusas. He trotted some 20 yards away from the gully and turned to watch the snail approach. It was traveling with its head lifted 3 feet above the ground and moving faster than before. Clavering changed his mind about taking another picture. He thought now to look around for more snails, and though he saw none, he cautioned himself not to rule out the possibility of a mate. It would hardly be pleasant to be cornered by 2 snails, yet the idea excited him. After all, how could he not escape from 2 slow, lumbering creatures like this? These what? His mind stuck on peaches because of the beautiful color of the shell. Amygdala persica? No. Carnivora, perhaps, Claveringi? That could be improved on. The professor thought as he walked backward, watching. He saw a little grove of trees, all about 20 feet high, and realized that if he stood there, where the snail could not reach him, he would be able to get a close view. He entered the grove. The snail circled it, looking for an opening. When it found none large enough, it raised its head and surged forward upon the trees. Branches cracked and one tree trunk snapped. Professor Clavering, who had been aiming his camera, ducked and backed out of the grove. He caught a glimpse of a great belly gliding unhurt over a jagged tree trunk. of a circular mouth 2 feet across, open to show the still wider upper band of shark-like teeth munching automatically up and down. The snail cruised gently over the treetops, some of which sprang back into position as the great weight left them. Click went the professor's camera. What a sight that had been! He imagined entertaining friends in California with an account of it, substantiated by the photograph, especially old Professor McElroy of the biology department, who had laughed at him for spending several $1,000s on a search sure to prove futile. Professor Clavering was beginning to tire now, so he headed directly for the Samantha, noticing that the snail had veered to a course that would intercept his if they both kept to their steady, though different speeds. He chuckled and trotted for a bit. The snail also picked up speed, and the professor remembered the wide, upward rippling of the snail's body as it hurtled the trees. It would be interesting to see how fast the snail was on a straight course. He reached what he was sure was the right spot on the beach, but the Samantha was not there. Could he have made a mistake? No, surely this. Then he caught sight of the Samantha, drifting half a mile out on the ocean. Damn, said Professor Clavering aloud. What had happened to the anchor? Did he dare to try swim to the boat? The distance frightened him, and it was growing steadily greater. Pebbles rattled behind him, and he turned. The snail was hardly 20 feet away. Professor Clavering trotted along the beach. There was bound to be some slits, some caves, however small, where he could be out of reach of the snail. He wanted very much to rest for a while, and he was annoyed by the prospect of a chilly night without blankets or food. He stopped dead, his shoes skidding on the sand. Ahead, not 50 feet along the beach, was another snail. It was as big as the one following him, but somewhat lighter in color. Its tail was in the sea, and its muzzle dripped water as it reared itself to get a look at the professor. It was this snail, Clavering thought, that had chewed through the hemp rope and let the boat go free. Was there something about new hemp rope that appealed to snails? He put the question out of his mind. There was a snail before him and one behind him now, after all, and trotted on along the shore. The place was most likely to provide crevices in which he could shelter. Was the gully where he had found the first snail. He headed for the gully, forcing himself to walk at a moderate pace and to breathe normally. After a while he sat down for a short rest. The snails appeared, searching, lifting their heads to look slowly right and left. The professor sat motionless, his head lowered, hoping they would not see him, but the first snail spotted it. But the first snail spotted him and altered its course. Behind it came the second snail. Wife, husband, there was no way of telling. Professor Clavering rose, and the weight of his hatchet reminded him that at least he had a weapon. A minor wound, he thought, might discourage them. Knowing that the snails were hungry, that their teeth could tear his flesh more easily than they tore trees, and that they would certainly be eaten by, and he would certainly be eaten by these creatures if he was careless, he nevertheless drew the hatchet and faced them. He was not a very formidable figure with his slight paunch and pale, skinny legs, his height only at about a third of that of the snail's. But above his glasses, his brow was set with determination. When the first snail reared 10 feet away, the professor advanced and swung his hatchet at the projecting mantle on its left side. But the blow fell inches short, and the weight of the hatchet pulled the professor off balance. He staggered and fell just under the snail's raised muzzle, and there was barely time to roll aside before the descending mouth touched the ground where he had been. Angry now, he circled the snail, then swung a blow at the nacreous shell, which turned the blade after it had made no more than an inch-deep chip. He swung again, higher this time and toward the rear of the shell, trying for the lung beneath. It was of no use. His target was too high, 10 feet from the ground, and again the hatchet took only a chip of shell. The snail began a turn to face him. Now the professor confronted the second snail, rushed and swung the hatchet, cutting it in the cheek so deeply that the blade sank up to its wooden handle. He had to tug to get it out. Then as the snail reared its head for a biting attack, he ran. Glancing back, he saw that no liquid, he had not, of course, expected blood, came from the cut in the snail's cheek. He couldn't see the cut, in fact, and the blow had certainly been no discouragement to the snail's advance. Professor Clavering walked at a sensible pace toward the snail's lair on the other side of the island. But by the time he scrambled down into the gully, he was winded and his legs hurt. The gully, he saw with relief, narrowed to a sharp V. Wedged in that, he would be safe. He was about to press into the V, which had an overhanging top, rather like a cave, when he saw that what he had taken for some rounded rocks were moving. At least some of them were. They were baby snails, larger than good-sized beach balls. And judging from the way they were devouring the grass, they were hungry. The head of one of the giant snails appeared high on the left, and as the snail began to descend the gully, a pair of antennae against the sky to the right signaled the arrival of the second giant. The professor had nowhere to turn except toward the sea. Not a bad idea, he thought, as these were land snails. He waded far out and turned left, waist deep in the water. Land snails or not, one of them was coming after him. Clavering waded closer to the land and thigh-deep water. He began to run. The first snail had entered the water boldly, and though it crept briefly at a depth of no more than several inches, it showed signs when it got abreast of Professor Clavering of being willing to go into deeper water. The professor hoped the other snail, the mother perhaps, had stayed with the young. But it hadn't. It was following along the land and accelerating. The professor plunged wildly for the shore. He would be able to move faster on solid ground. He saw rocks, great igneous masses covering a slope down to the sea. Thank goodness. There was bound to be a niche, some place he could take shelter for the night. It would soon be dark, he knew. The sun was sinking rapidly into the ocean. Reaching the rocks, he flung himself into a narrow trough formed by a cluster of boulders. They rose 2 feet above his body, and the trough was hardly a foot wide. A snail couldn't, he reasoned, stick its head down here and bite him. The peach-toned curves of the snail's shells appeared. One snail drew close. "I'll strike it with my hatchet," the professor swore to himself. "I'll cut its face to ribbon with my knife." He was reconciled now to killing both adults. A pair of baby snails would be much easier to take back, and they would do just as well. The snail seemed to sniff like a dog, though inaudibly, as its muzzle hovered above where the professor lay. Then with majestic calm it crept forward over the boulders. Its slimy body covered the trough, blocking out all light. In panic, Professor Clavering drew his hunting knife and plunged it several times into the soft flesh. The snail seemed not even to wince, and the professor realized that the stabs could not have touched any vital organs. He pressed frantically with his palms against the snail's body and felt his hands slip and scrape against rock. The firmness of the snail, his inability to budge it, made him feel slightly sick for a moment, but at least, he thought, though his trench was covered, the irregularity of the rocks permitted a supply of air. An hour passed. To the professor, it was like a prolonged hallucination. He dreamed that 20,000 pairs of teeth were chewing him into a heap of ground meat. which the two giant snails shared with their offspring. To add to his misery, he was cold and hungry and thirsty. The snail's cool body gave no warmth at all, yet at last the professor slept. Hours later, he woke to see stars above him. The snails had departed. Careful not to make a sound, he rose and stepped from the trough. Free, on a sandy stretch of beach only a few yards away, he lay down again and slept the remaining hours until dawn. He woke just in time, as if by some sixth sense. The snails were moving toward him, one now only 10 feet away. On trembling legs, the professor trotted inland and up a slope. An idea came to him. If he could push a boulder, say 500 pounds, it would be possible with a lever, onto an adult snail in the gully and smash the spot below which its lung lay, then the snail would die. He could think of no other means at his disposal that might inflict a fatal injury. His gun was on the drifting Samantha. The professor brooded. It might be at least a week before help came from the Metusas. The Samantha would not necessarily float back there, would not necessarily be seen by another ship for days. And even if it was seen, would it be apparent she was drifting? And would the spotters make a beeline for the Metusas to report it? Not necessarily. The professor bent to lick some dew from a leaf. Straightening, he saw that the snails were 20 yards behind him now. The trouble is, I'm becoming exhausted, he thought. He was even more tired at noon. Only one snail still pursued him, but the other, he imagined, was probably resting or eating a treetop in order to be fresh later. And so the day passed. The professor would trot 100 yards, then find a spot to rest, but he dared not shut his eyes lest he sleep. Weakened also by lack of food, he gave up the idea of dropping a rock down the gully onto a snail. Dusk came. He had lost his bearings, and he could not find the slope where the igneous rocks had hidden him the night before. And both snails were following him now. Professor Clavering took a deep breath and faced facts. He would have to make some kind of attempt to kill the snails, or at least frighten them off before dark. After some thought, he chopped down a slender tree and hacked off its branches, the leaves of which were devoured by the two snails only moments after the branches struck the ground. Dragging his tree, the professor managed to sharpen one end of it with his hatchet as he moved along. It was too heavy to wield with one hand, but grasped with two it would serve as kind of a giant spear. As soon as he was satisfied with the point, Professor Clavering turned and attacked, running with the spear pointed slightly upward, aimed at the first snail's mouth. He struck too slow, and the tree point penetrated about 4 inches into the snail's chest. No vital organs here, he knew, except the long, straight esophagus, which in these giant snails would have been set deeper than 4 inches. The spear hung for a few seconds in the snail's flesh, then fell out onto the ground, and the professor retreated, pulling his hatchet from his belt. The second snail, coming up abreast of the other, paused to chew a few inches off the tree spear. Then, like its mate, it gave its attention to Professor Clavering. There was something contemptuous, he thought, something absolutely assured about their slow progress toward him. It was as if they were thinking, escape us 100, 1,000 times. We shall finally reach you and devour every trace of you. The professor advanced again, circled the snail he had stabbed with the tree spear, and swung his hatchet at the rear of its shell, hacking over and over again at the same spot. For now he had a plan. After 6 or 7 blows, the hacking operation had to be halted. The second snail was coming up behind him, An antenna brushed moistly against the professor's leg, staggering him as he stepped out of the way. He considered the value of more blows against the first snail. The shell was by no means broken, but he had no strength left now for such an effort with the hatchet. He picked up his tree spear, leveled it, and ran toward the snail with desperate purpose. The spear stuck where the hatchet blows had landed and broke through the shell. The snail writhed, then reared up in pain. Professor Clavering's hands had been lacerated by splinters, but he lifted the end of the drooping spear and pushed it with all his might farther into the snail, upward toward the lung. Then, since he was quite incapable of taking on the other snail in the same manner, he stumbled wearily away. In a moment he looked back. The unhurt snail was 30 feet behind him. The wounded snail facing him was motionless, half in and half out of its shell, suffering some silent agony of asphyxiation. Whether it died or not, it was no longer a threat. Professor Clavering walked on, feeling close to physical collapse himself. Quite by accident, just before dark, he came upon the slope of igneous rocks, and again he found a trench that would give him shelter. Soon after he lay down, the snout of the second snail probed above the trench, but he tried not to think about it. He tried to plan ahead. Would it be best to remain in the trench tomorrow, to hope for rain, for water? He fell asleep without deciding. When he woke at dawn, he found that, as before, the snail had departed. His hands throbbed, and he saw that his palms were encrusted with dried blood and sand. It would be wise to wash them quickly in salt water. But the giant snail lay between him and the sea. At his approach, it crept forward. Professor Clavering made a wobbling detour and reached the sea. He dipped his hand and moved them rapidly back and forth, then lifted water to his face. He longed to wet his dry mouth, warned himself that he should not, and yielded nevertheless, though he spat out the water almost at once. The giant snail was very close now. Angrily, the professor flung handfuls of water at his face. Land snails hated salt. The snail only lifted its head higher, out of range, an oddly graceful movement, like that of a horned gazelle. The professor trudged away, but not quickly enough. The snail's head came down on his shoulder. The great mouth clamped. The professor screamed as shirt, flesh, and possibly a piece of bone were torn away from his left shoulder. The snail's weight had pushed him into the sea, but he struggled to his feet and back to land. Blood streamed hotly down his side. He could not bear to look at his shoulder to see what had happened. He would not have been surprised if, in the very next instant, his left arm had dropped off. He walked on aimlessly along the shore, still going faster than the snail. Then, looking toward the empty horizon, he saw a dark spot on the water. He stopped, wondering if this were some trick of his eyes, but in a moment he made out the double hull of a catamaran, and surely that was Professor Steed's straw hat. Help had come from the Matusas. "Hello!" Professor Clavering was shocked by the hoarse feebleness of his own voice. It could not possibly have been heard. But there was hope now, and his strength increased. He ran forward along the shore to a little beach and stood waving his good right arm. "Professor Steed, this way, on the beach." Yes, he could definitely see Professor Steed's hat and 4 dark native heads. There was no answering shout, and Professor Clavering saw that the accursed snail was now only 30 feet away. Until the rescue party found him, he would have to protect himself. He saw a cranny in a rocky slope just behind the beach, and near it a boulder almost 2 feet in diameter. With what remained of his strength, the professor rolled the boulder up to the cranny, wiggled in behind it, and managed to pull the huge stone a bit closer to the cranny mouth. He was safely barricaded now against the snail. "Professor Steed, this way!" he shouted again, but still no answer came. He peered out through a slit above the boulder. The catamaran was just rounding a projection of land far to the right. In a moment it had vanished. But they were going to land, Professor Clavering told himself. Surely they were going to land. A quarter of an hour passed, during which the giant snail crept to within 10 feet of the cranny and lay still, waiting. And then Professor Steed, straw-hatted, a camera slung around his neck, came trotting down the beach behind the snail. "Here I am," shouted Professor Clavering. "Here." Professor Steed halted, looked about, and saw the snail. The old man's shock was apparent. He fell back a step, then another, then came forward again, shaking his head in disbelief. "Look out," Professor Clavering called. "It's dangerous." "It is?" Professor Steed stood with his eyes fixed upon the giant snail. His voice shook. "After all these years, you can't imagine how It exists! It exists!" He unslung his camera and named it with trembling hands. "Be careful," Professor Clavering warned, though the snail had not moved. "Call the natives. Tell them to bring the boat." Only now did Professor Steed seem to realize who had called. Giving the snail a wide berth, he trotted up to the barricaded cranny. "So there you are, Clavering. We saw your boat adrift and supposed you had been swept overboard and drowned. Nevertheless, I felt we might just have a look over the island." The old man's voice rose again. "But I never supposed to see this incredible snail. So much of my life spent searching, so many years." Call the natives, please," Professor Clavering interrupted him. "I'm hurt. Get me a doctor." "They're looking for you on the other side of the island." Professor Steed spoke quite slowly now, as if he were puzzling something out. "They'll come in time. Yes, in time. Half an hour, perhaps." He put his camera carefully back into its case and laid both hands against the boulder that sealed the cranny. "Here, I'll help you," he said, pushing. "Let me help you." "No, not until the natives have driven off the snail," said Professor Clavering from behind the boulder. To his astonishment, Professor Steed paid no heed, and then suddenly the astonishment turned to dread. Professor Steed was not going to wait for the natives. He was going to tell the world that there had been no trace of Professor Clavering on the island, that he must surely have been swept from his boat and drowned. Professor Steed was going to claim the giant snail as his own discovery. Professor Clavering clawed frantically at the boulder, but Professor Steed was in a better position. The boulder rolled away, and as it did, the giant snail roused itself. Ignoring Professor Steed, who had prudently drawn aside, the snail surged forward into the cranny. Professor Clavering sank weakly to his knees. It was a nightmare of some sort, and as in a nightmare he could not move. "Something or other Steedy. Professor Steed murmured, gloating, "My name shall live." Those were the last words Professor Clavering heard, and their sound was mumble. Those were the last words Professor Clavering heard, and their sound was muffled by the crunching of thousands of pairs of teeth in his own flesh.